Good evening, everyone, again. I'm Rusaslina Idris from Pusat Sejarah Rakyat. Really happy to have everyone here again joining us for this is our sixth webinar in our series, exploring people's history, looking at different kinds of research and methodologies. And we've had some really interesting discussions and presentations in this past, I guess we started sometime late last year. So today I'm really excited to have with us Razan Roseman, who will be presenting on representations of Malay cosmopolitan from the looking at 1930s newspaper ads. And we have with us also Dr. Simon Soon, who will be our discussant. And I'm most excited about Adriana Nordin Manan, who will be our moderator today. I'm sure she will do an amazing job. Let me just read a little bit about our speaker, our moderator. So Adriana Nordin Mana is a writer, playwright, translator, and researcher. Born, raised, and based in Kuala Lumpur, she is fascinated by the expanse of stories as mirrors to society and monuments to the human condition. Adriana has a master's in politics from New York University and a bachelor's in globalization and social justice from Colby College. Thank you again for being with us. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Adriana to moderate this webinar today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn, for that warm welcome. Hi, and good evening to everyone. Just as Lynn mentioned, this is the Pusat Sejarah Rakyat webinar with the title Representation of Cosmopolitan Malays in 1930s Newspapers. Now, I'm very pleased to have in our seminar the speaker, Razan Roseman. And Razan is a fine arts student who doesn't paint. He is currently based in University Science Malaysia, Penang. And Razan's work deal with the visual imageries and the historical context that they address. His current interests include identity formation, landscapes, and nationalism in the Malay world and Southeast Asia. And our commentator this evening is Dr. Simon Soon, who is a senior lecturer at the Visual Arts Program, Faculty of Creative Arts, University Malaya. An art historian and curator, Simon is also part of the core team at the Malaysian Design Archive. His research can be characterized very broadly as social art history, which reflects an interest in approaching art history from below. Welcome, Razan and Simon. It's an honor to have you guys this evening. And without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Razan.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me today. I think before we start talking about visual imageries and whatnot, we should start talking about the context of the 1930s itself, especially in Malaya, and my focus will be particularly on Singapore. I think we know that during the 1930s, it was an interwar period where there was there is a rising nationalisms around the region itself, and also one other thing that we should take into note is the Great Depression that were there during that time. So this Great Depression had a huge impact on every sector of economy, except one, which is like the publishing and printing industry. And during that time also, the Malay, it was said that the Malay publication, the Malay journalism reached its golden age during that time. And then also when you see in the context of 1930s, actually it's before that in Malaya, around the 1920s, there was already increasing numbers of publications being published around the state, so to speak. And this is especially in Singapore. And one of the things that there is glaring is the increasing amount of sort of like illustrations and pictorial materials that can be seen in the newspapers, and this is also include the Malay newspapers. One of the things that we should notice is how this these illustrations are portrayed. One of which that we can see is the advertisement itself. When we talk about advertisement and when we talk about the context of that era, we can see there is also an increasing of recreational activities, as well as leisure and entertainment activities, such as like there are many clubs, Malay clubs being established around Singapore: football club, badminton club, tennis club, and these are joined by not the wealthy Malays, so to speak, but also by the majority of urban Malays at that time. Some of the ads, I will share some of them. These are around 1920s, I think. The Erasmic. Yeah, if you can see there has been quite a bit of advertisement on beauty product, especially to ladies, such as soap and everything. And also there's also the increasing numbers of entertainment related advertisements, especially on gramophone, and there's also portrayals on latest hits like Laila Majnun and something like that. And I think one of the most interesting ads to see is the cigarette ads. There are a lot of cigarette ads during that time, such as this is one of the famous brands at that time lah. One of the things that interests me is representation of the woman in that ad itself, where women are portrayed as promoting these cigarettes, and just like this ad, we can see there are two things that can be observed from this ad itself. One is how this ad try to incorporate these leisure activities and products such as cigarettes and sort of like entertainment thing like cards and whatnot into the Malay regular life, daily life. So you can see how these gentlemen are playing cards, wearing their baju Melayu and sarung while smoking cigarettes, as if it is a normal thing to them. So it is the normalization of these kinds of products into their daily lives. And another thing is another side is how these ads also portray a kind of unique, not unique, sorry, a kind of Malays that feels different from the Malay folk that I think we can guess at that time. They are very much modern in their appearance and also kind of westernized. And this one is how the Lux toilet soap try to incorporate uh, film stars from US into their advertisement, which suggests that there is also a degree of consumption on entertainment and films among these Malays. Due to that, they are being presented in newspaper advertisement here. But I think that when we talk about uh, how the representation of cosmopolitan Malays during that time, it closely related it closely related to actually how these Malays are perceived and represented, especially by the early Malay nationalists and intelligentsias at that time. And most prominent, we can see it from the Kesatuan Melayu Singapura and Utusan Melayu as an extension. One of the prominent critique of these kinds of Malays is came from Utusan Melayu itself, and especially Kajai, which is done through, there are a lot of writings that criticize Malays at that time, but there is also a huge number of illustrations that specifically portray these Malays and criticize them. One of it is the Wak Ketuk character, illustrated by Ali Sanat and written, it is a like pojok or column at that time, and written by Kajai.
Sorry, Razan. There's
Yes.
a bit of macam that sound, like a
The
very
buzzing sound.
yeah. Just I don't know. I think maybe when you move a little bit, it there's a sound. Maybe don't move so much. I don't know if that works or not, but you can try that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So Wak Ketuk is a trademark character in Utusan Zaman. Utusan Zaman is a weekly newspaper for Utusan Melayu. So it started publication around November 1939 and ended just before World War II. But during that 2.5 years, it already published, I think it published this kind of illustrations in every publication without miss. So in one publication, in one issue, there might be around 5 to 6 illustrations of Wak Ketuk itself. And also there are some photos taken, such as photos of wars during around the world, and also local photos like lawatan to madrasah, or photos of football club, badminton club, and school sports and whatnot. So these are the kinds of things that were covered in Utusan Zaman at that time. Like it served as purpose as a light reading for students as a weekly publication. So Wak Ketuk is one of the famous character, I think the only character that exists before World War II. So he usually he criticized two segments of community societies or community. One is what I call the other Muslim, which is the Jawi Peranakan and the Arab Peranakan. That during that time there were a political contestation between Malays, the called Malays from Utusan, and also this group of Jawi Peranakan and Arab Peranakan, because they were seen as to monopolize one in terms of economy and also in terms of publishing industry as well. That's why Utusan was established as a pure Malay publication. And then the other one is criticism towards the Malay society itself. So it doesn't work like one way, just one way. Like Utusan only criticize the other Muslim as a form of distinction from what Malay is. They also criticize the other Malay, which is clarified as the urban Malays. If you can see, this is Wak Ketuk. So if you see the photos, he clearly seems like out of place. He's shorter from his partner, and also he doesn't really know how to dance. In a way, it shows that this shows that how these urban Malays are actually couldn't fit in the so-called modern community of Singapore, and by abandoning their roots. Some of the photos is this is a critique towards the Arab Peranakan. Actually, this is sort of like the ridicule character that Kajai and Ali Sanat used to attack the Arab Peranakan Wak Pecukong is named. And then this is how the usual sketch that Ali Sanat made to present sort of like how these modernized Malays are at home and public. So this is also how they enjoy their leisure time.
Razan, if you don't use your mic, boleh tak? Would that be possible? If you
Sorry?
if you don't use your mic. Oh, actually, whatever you just did, it stopped the buzzing.
Can you still hear me? Hello?
Yeah. Yes, yes. Okay, I think that's good because the sound was a bit too high pitch.
I see.
Okay. All right.
So this is okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So these are the kinds of Malays that Kajai attack and distinct himself from the majority of Malay folk at that time, and what he called the sporting spirit Malay, which usually denotes modernized Malays that already abandoned their Malay cultural roots, living in the city and working in a wage labor system like peon or low level clerk, and always spending their money on entertainment and lavish lifestyle. So this is typically what we can see the typical representation of the Malay urban Malay at that time. Uh, the husband will wear sort of like a blazer and sarong, complete with tie, and the wife will don the short kebaya, ketat kebaya, and also their children. And I think this Malay nationalists not only criticize them just for the sake of criticizing, because there is also something that they wanted to propose actually at that time, which is like try to portray this segment of Malays as un-Malay, in a sense that they are now seen as the other Malays who already detached from their cultural roots. This is, from my perspective, is a strategy used by the nationalists at that time to reinforce sort of the notion of Malay and Malayness amongst the Malay community by first excluding the Jawi and Arab Peranakan from the sort of like Malay category, and secondly by excluding these modern Malays from the Malay category. In so doing, they also propose their own version of what ought to be like, what is Malay and Malayness. And I see this critique as not only tied to the behavior and appearance of these urban Malays, but also tied to the landscape where they are, landscape or setting where they are residing. If you can see this illustration, for example, these urban Malays are portrayed to be living in a city, and you can see their costume is also different and having a different job from the traditional Malay. And by doing so, they try to attach a sense of, one is towards the land, and also towards how Malay ought to behave and ought to be. What is actually thing that we call Malay, and this is to, for me, to create a solid political identity together the Malays at that time under one banner of Malay nationalism. And it doesn't stop there, I think. When the war broke, and then the British came back, there's PKMM and PKM, but there's also another strands of Malays that base their interpretation on this kind of notion of identity and still persists until now. I think that is uh, my presentation for now. Maybe we can discuss a bit further from questions and side for now.
Thank you, Razan. We have a request actually, if you don't mind. Could we go through the photos again? You know, just one quick like sweep, because they were really nice and they
Which
were really rich. Actually, boleh ke all of them? Just
one?
like a quick slideshow. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
So these are the ads, cigarette ads. Soap ad. Then
No, the slides, sorry, the slides are not running, I think.
I've been clicking it.
Yeah, it's not running. Maybe you need to stop share again and then share. Actually, this is much clearer, Razan, without the mic.
Yeah, now we have.
Is it
Now
showing?
we see the Erasmic beware of imitations. Yeah. Yeah, it's good now.
And I think I forgot to mention that if you see some of the cartoons that were made in Utusan, it actually has like this cartoon has a nude painting at the back, which is at that time it can be quite controversial because during the 1920s there's a huge debate between like kaum muda and kaum tua regarding the use of figure uh, in drawing and whatnot.
Have we reached the end of the photos?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much, Razan, for that. That was very interesting, and I can already picture a few questions that I personally would like to ask. But I'd like to call upon Simon, our commentator this evening, to share a few words. Over to you, Simon.
First, Razan, can you stop sharing your slide so we can see? Thank you.
Okay, I'm just trying to. Okay. Hello. Okay, so Assalamualaikum and Selamat Petang. Thank you so much, Razan, for such a visually rich presentation. I think it's a real treat for many of us to explore this on a period in our history that's arguably, very much talked about, but very seldom explored in detail, right? And I've been actually asked earlier to see if there's a way to steer the conversation towards thinking about methodology and more specifically how to think about history through images and what do images actually show us about the past, or how do we even talk about them? So often we assume that when it comes to textual sources, we possess so much more interpretive confidence, right? Partly because, there has been the convention of academia to work with textual sources, but this is not the case when it comes to the visual image, which when it's introduced, a lot of us will start panicking. How do I read the image? What if I overinterpret? Or what do I look out for? How much should I say? And how do I know if this is not just my subjective interpretation. All those things will start racing in our thoughts. However, maybe more than that is really that when we say that we want to work with visual images in our historical research, there's also this tendency to use photographs or images solely as a kind of supplementary illustration of historical events. So it stands in or simply serves the purpose of supplying evidence for still a primarily text-centered view of the world, right? So I thought it was interesting that I think in one of your articles that you've published, you've actually used Colster and Mayer and highlighted how they talked about the power of the text as something that is very ambiguous, that it might not be, they may not only be regarded as providing examples for imitation, but can also, albeit not without risk, be read as a kind of reflection on Malay identity. But I'm very curious because in the text itself, you seem to suggest that the citation was used to support an approach that takes the newspaper almost at face value. So I think you prioritize the newspaper's immediate nature and its capacity to inform us of real-time responses. And therefore, the visual materials also deepen our understanding of that period. Whereas I was reading Colster and Mayer quite differently, and I wonder if you care to sort of explain more how you have come to that understanding, because unlike you, I thought he was quite suspicious of how the text is not only ambiguous, but when read as reflections of Malay identity, reality, one actually faces a kind of certain risk. One actually faces certain risk, and rather than believing a newspaper's immediacy or that it is a kind of neutral mirror, the statement was more of a caution against using newspaper to reflect on the realities of the Malay as a community. And in fact, I think this is confirmed later in Mayer's 2010 essay where he writes on Kajai, and he discusses how complex and difficult it is to write about the 1930s in Malaya, since this period, more than say the 1950s, was, and I quote him here, driven as it is by a longing that creates evocations of the past that are of necessity inauthentic and unreal, because the past it seeks has never existed except in narrative. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to sort of like say that, but at the same time, I think what he's hinting at is really how difficult it is, because what we're dealing with is we're dealing with a lot of fragments, and we're dealing with a lot of like representations, and whether these representations are actually simply evocations of ideal world rather than a reflection of the lived reality is something that he wants us to debate more about. I guess why I'm sort of like curious if this is something that you've thought more extensively about is as I was sort of trying to formulate a response to your presentation, I was spending my afternoon after class today trying to look through what are some of the visual cultures of the 1930s. What else can I find? And it happens that I've chanced upon quite a number of, as you said, different competing forms of representations, right? And I'll run them through just so that it enriches and adds to what we understand that Utusan is actually speaking to or against in the Malay sort of like, in the Malay media during that time. So I think what is seldom sort of like very often talked about, but seldom actually, people actually seldom see is that Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi's novel, which is often sort of like called the first novel, the Hikayat Farida Hanum, actually includes, actually uses the photograph on its cover, and it's a kind of like repurposing of a photograph of a Caucasian model posing in front of the mirror, and then uses this as a stand-in for the person of Farida Hanum, who is the protagonist of the novel. Even in as early as sort of like mid-20s, I think there's already a renewed interest in trying to understand what the visual can do over and above the text itself. And you see this playing out very strangely in like this kind of self-fashioning of this author that I cannot find very much information about. His name is Raja Mansor, and he publishes in the mid-30s a lot of pulp novels, with really strange titles. Some of them not even very politically correct, right? Like Kenapa Kahwin Dengan Keling and all these kind of like strange dua perawan, Bidadari, Tanah Melayu, all these strange titles, and all of them are now, a lot of them are actually digitized by UKM, and you can find it.
Sorry to interject. I just wanted to read out a request from a member of the audience. Is it possible to have the slides in play format so they appear bigger on screen?
Oh yeah, sorry.
All right, thank you.
Sorry. Okay, I'm going to go back. So this is the much talked about but little seen cover of Syed Al Hadi's Farida Hanum. And then this is like Raja Mansor, who's like a pulp writer. He calls himself a journalist. And in his Jawi sort of like rendering, it's always transliterated as journalist rather than wartawan, right? But he has this sort of like self-fashioning thing going on, and he publishes so many of these pulp books out of Klang, specifically, and very often it has a interesting kind of like problematic gender dimension to it. But then he's also selling things with advertisements that are sort of like slid into many of his publications. And some of these ads are quite visually arresting because they then sort of scramble the code and of what is modern and tradition, right? And really sort of like trying to negotiate between, any sort of like, fixed definition of what these two terms mean. And then, of course, you have also the SI Sultan Idris Training College, right? The Teachers College, where you have the students putting up plays like Malay version of the Macbeth, and in the following year or in 2 years later, they would stage like Faust. So if modernity is almost like kind of Faustian bargain, I wonder if we need to sort of like adopt a much more nuanced view of what is happening in the sort of like 1980s by taking into account all these kinds of competing representations and not assume that, for example, the newspaper is offering the newspaper is a space that reflects reality, while the ads that carries it are simply forms of persuasion or simply forms of persuasion. Rather, maybe both ads and illustrations are actually representations themselves, and they exist within this larger kind of like literary conversation where there are also many other competing forms of representation, like what I've shown you, and they don't always exist in absolute terms. Very often, they show attempts at trying to negotiate through what it means to be modern. So there could be someone who comes from a very religious perspective, but ultimately still, like this, what this pantone suggests is, agama didik modern dibela, that you can have both as well. Or that even with the sort of like pertukaran modern yang tidak elok pada penglihatan umum, that cara modern yang diawasi oleh agama kita yang suci can in fact bring some kind of progress, or that there's also this call for modesty in kemodernan yang janganlah yang melampaui, right? And so there, in trying to search for new ways to mengarang or in trying to sort of like find, you know, in order to appreciate the modern amongst the youth who are searching for new literature, to think about what it means to live today, or even sort of like marveling at the engineering feat of Bridge, as well as recognizing the importance of an important publication from Majalah Guru on modern terms. I think these are very interesting ways we can then begin to complicate the kind of binary that sometimes looking at Kajai's writing doesn't quite sort of you know, we're only seeing one part of the story in Kajai's writing, I feel. And that leads me to the question, I think, for Rozan, what might you think that, what do you think the illustrations might be doing differently from the text? And correct me if I'm wrong, I know that Kajai was heavily involved, even when even to the extent of instructing the illustrator to paint in a certain way. But I feel also there are some and I think it was in your article that you say that you think Wakato is in some ways Kajai's alter ego, right? However, if we take the image or the visual form as a language distinct from the text, and that it might be doing something else or might be communicating something, information in a different way, then I'm curious if like the illustrations are doing something that the text isn't doing. And if you have done enough, I wonder if you've done any close reading to show us maybe new sort of like details that is not simply there to confirm what the text has already said, but actually tells us something else. It might reveal a different kind of voice, even in opposition to the textual voice or the general tone of the paper. Is this something that you've explored? It's something I want to ask. And my second question is, perhaps when we think about those illustrations, I guess I would like to also get a sense of the numbers. You mentioned briefly that, you know, in an issue of Utusan Zaman, you would typically have 4 to 5 illustrations of Wakato. So what is the general content? And if you can sort of like provide a sense of the overview, then maybe we can perhaps, you know, situate the images that you've shown us in a context, much better in a kind of like context. And what kind of, what other kinds of like illustrations sits beside, say, you know, satires of Wakato? Like, are there other kind of more kids-friendly comics, or are there ornamental fillers? Are there, you know, epic-driven kind of narratives that are also popular? So giving a sense of, I would like to get a sense of Utusan Zaman and Wata Ahad and Wata Jenaka, and what kind of illustrations can we expect to see in the pre-war period? Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Adriana, you...
Yeah, no, I because Simon had a question, had questions. So maybe what we can do is you can answer Simon's questions first, and then we can proceed to take questions from the floor. I see we already have a few. Yeah, so over to you first, Razan, to respond to Simon.
I think in terms of like Kajai's text writing and the illustrations made by Alisana, this is what I noticed from browsing through the cartoon sections. It actually the other way around. Like mostly Kajai's writing seems like try to fit in what Alisana is sketching. Okay, this is one of the sources that the only sources I think from Isama Ismail that he said that usually Alisana will sketch the illustration first, and Kajai will write whatever it is based on the illustrations. And I think there are sometimes that they would agree on sort of part of like something like they want to project or see. And secondly, about the sorry,
the numbers, and you know what's how many Wakatos are there in each issue, and if you could give us a sense of the the big picture.
I think I can only talk based on like my observation on Utusan Zaman and several Malay newspapers at the time lah, because there is also a growing, like I said before, growing interest on providing more pictorial materials to their readers, especially in light readings, Utusan Zaman, Watak Jenaka, and Watak Ahad. So before the war, Utusan Zaman is the only, Wak Ketuk is the only trademark character, so to speak, that exists before that lah. So just a single pane, that's Wak Ketuk. And I think Utusan Zaman published quite a number of these illustrations. Not only that Wak Ketuk, but there's also some other illustrations that come with, sometimes there are short stories and there will be illustrations at the title page for the short stories, and maybe some gurindam, there will be some illustrations there also. And this also similar to, I think, Warta Jenaka and Watak Ahad, there will be some illustration accompanying the short stories. So in terms of numbers, I don't think I can provide some concrete numbers, but I think we can say that illustrations and pictorial content mostly has become sort of like a norm in the 1930s throughout towards the war. And also the content is mostly satire, either to the colonial or to the Malay society itself or to the other communities, or also like describing world events. There's also some issues where Wak Ketuk is seeing, like commenting on Hitler, like ridiculing Hitler and Nazi. Wait, let me check if I still have it. This is one of the example, I think. So they also been covering wars between Nazis, and before that the Italo-Germany war and whatnot, through pictorial materials. And also there are sections that comment on the issues lah. So it doesn't really restrict on the discussion between the Malays itself.
I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question. In choosing, like, say this image over other image that maybe doesn't have such a strong political or social content, are you in a way trying to highlight certain? I mean, how do you sort of like decide what to sort of highlight and if it's actually, if you're only sort of like highlighting this, do we get a comprehensive picture of, the range of visual materials that's actually in those publications? Because I'm curious only because I think there are around 5 to 7 publications already on at least illustrations in the 30s, especially in the Malay presses. But at the same time, I often see the same images being used to discuss whatever topic that is raised in that particular article. So I'm also very curious at why, if there's such a range of visual cultural material, why is every researcher going back to address the same image? I would hope to see more diversity, but I don't know why. Is it because all of you identified that there's something really important to say about this selection of images that we want to focus on that and at the expense of others? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think firstly, to be honest, is because the availability of the materials.
Okay.
That's the thing. And most of the images, especially in newspapers in the 20s, it's hard to find them, and only in archive negara lah. And that's also quite hard to search. And second,
is it complete? Is it complete? Is it complete? Are the issues complete?
For Utusan Zaman,
Mm-hmm.
I would say I did miss several issues, but that is because it's not there in the microfilm. But almost complete, I think, for 2 years. And then why people tend to return to the same images, I think it also says that in a way, that there are other kinds of approach or interpretations being used on not only these Malays, but also what are they advocating and how they do it. For me, I think it doesn't only work like just us versus them, but there's also an internal negotiation of what actually means by Malay identity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Razan. Thank you very much, Simon, for that, kicking off our question and answer. So I'd first like to address the crowd before we proceed. How we're going to do this Q&A is feel free to write in the comments in the chat section, or if you look under reactions, if you click on that, there's an option to raise your hand, so you can also do that. So I will kick things off, Razan, by reading out the questions that we already have. Okay, so from Dr. Kaur, one of the ads that you showed features 2 European women and soap, if I'm not mistaken. What are your observations and thoughts in regards to the place of whiteness in portraying cosmopolitan Malays? Why do you think those illustration was chosen to portray cosmopolitan Malay and not specifically modern Malay in terms of terminology?
I think in a sense that when we talk about how these ads comes to Malaya, and the it really goes to, we're not only just consuming the soap if we buy it, or the film stars if you can identify them, but it also means that we're consuming sort of like the exported culture from that said country, which is in this case maybe it is the US, and the film stars by watching the films or identifying yourself with those film stars. We're not only like being modern in a sense lah, but we're also consuming a certain kind of cultures, and also it also reflects in the distinct social status or attributes that they exert among their peers, the normal Malayfolk. I think so.
Sorry, thank you, Razan. I'll move to the second question, and there are 2 parts to it. Yeah, so we'll start. It's by Fiona Lee. Question: what is the significance of language in your analysis of these visual images of the modern cosmopolitan Malay? For example, how is it significant that these images are in a Jawi as opposed to Rumi Malay newspaper?
Actually, before the 1970s, most of the Malays, Jawi is the sort of like official writing system for Malays. Not until like 70s, there's a demand for more Rumi, and they also there's also a huge issue when they wanted to convert the Jawi system to Rumi system. So basically, the use of Jawi script in 1930s is a common thing actually, the only newspapers that use Rumi is usually the English newspapers and the Peranakan Chinese newspaper. And Malay mostly use Jawi lah. Not until maybe 50 there's one or two that use Rumi, but that also aim to cater to a larger crowd lah.
Thank you. And then the second half of the question is...
Sorry, actually, maybe I think the question was asking for slightly something else, if I can help to interpret it a bit and see if we can get a different answer from it. I think Fiona is asking whether if, say, the same advertisement or the same comic were to appear in a Rumi publication, would it have the same meaning as opposed to existing in a Jawi publication?
We were going to go to that part of the question, Simon. Yeah, that was because there's two parts to it. Okay. So that was going to be the second one. You can see, yeah. But thank you though. Yeah, so over to you, Razan.
You mean still in the context of 1930s?
I think the second question there is, did the same images appear in newspapers in other languages, for example, Rumi or English? And if they did, what could be maybe the different interpretations or meanings that is being presented in these other language media?
I don't think they appear in other language media newspapers, but other newspapers also have their own sort of like illustrations or cartoonists that do this thing for them. And then of course but the concern I think is probably much similar lah, especially between the locals at that time. If in Singapore we have like Utusan Zaman and Wak Ketuk talking about how this sort of like modernization is encroaching and threatening the Malay cultural traditions. The same thing was happening in Penang, in Straits Eco, where mostly the straight Chinese or the maybe the wealthier Indian community are talking about the image of the modern girl, like Sulin West people, where they're also the concern is the same. They see it as a threat to their cultural tradition because their younger generations are slowly turning into sort of like westernized girls and abandoning their cultural roots.
Thank you, Razan. Members of the audience, feel free to add more questions. And if I may, actually, I was curious about something. What really struck me, Razan, was when you talked about the criticisms that were being taken to, if we may call them sub-communities, subgroups, right, of the Malays, the Jawi Peranakan and the Arab Peranakan, right? I was wondering, is there a significance that Wak Ketuk seems to, like he's wearing what is very recognizably like Javanese attire, at least to me. Was there a commentary on the Javanese community hidden there, perhaps?
No, I think what Alisana intended to make Wak Ketuk as close as to Kajai, because if you see Kajai is from the Minang descent.
Okay.
And what is being said that that's his usual attire lah. He's wearing songkok, pagoda shirt, blazer and sarung to office and everything. That's one thing about that. It also tells that how during that time the Malay, not Malay, sorry, the people of this region are seen as part of the Malay community in Malaya. Like Minang is also Malay, Javanese is also Malay, in Malaya specifically, because I think most of the Malay nationalists also came as a descent from Indonesia.
So to clarify, when they were taking aim or criticizing the Jawi Peranakan or the Arab Peranakan, that was very clearly also stating that they were not part of the Malay community. They don't make it up.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. While we're waiting for more questions, I'm not sure if you if you had the chance to take a look at this, but I was very curious actually, and it's just something that came automatically to me, is that question about women, the representation of women. I don't know, Razan, like, do you have any opinion? Because what I gathered from your response is that women, as we see even until today, it's like the virtue of society is placed on women, right? On their behavior, how they dress, and everything. So was there also, how should I word this? Was there also an aim to critique women, and when they said, for example, if there was criticism about the way women dressed at that time, right? Like that was becoming a bit more modern. Was the criticism there aimed at the women, as in like they had their free agency as their own individuals to choose, or was it still very much with a patriarchal hue, you know, where you basically communicating to the men folk in the society, like, oh, I mean, I'm have to switch to Malay lah for this. It's like, oh, tolong jaga sikit kaum wanita kita, macam mana tata cara mereka, perlakuan. Was there any maybe insight to the gender dynamics in these representations?
I think in terms of, this is only for Wak Ketuk I can talk lah. Kajai didn't actually directly attack the woman lah in general, but he often used Malay woman as example to show the failure of this Malay culture as an example lah, because sporting spirit is closely, he often use sporting spirit with women, gadis sporting spirit, and they are presented as wild, liar, and they also sort of like kaki kike, so you have to have a lot of money to get this sporting spirit girl, and you have to also be cool if your sporting spirit girl go out with another man, and sort of like that. So he didn't attack women directly, but he used women as a sort of like as a benchmark to show how 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 crucial the situation is lah in terms of that Malay culture tradition.
Thank you. Wanita sporting spirit. Why do I mean, does it give me images of like sarung party girl in Singapore in the 90s or something? Always, right? Always virtue is anointed on women and how we dress and things like that. So there's a follow-up question here. So would you say that women became a flashpoint or a focus point of the Malay community's moral health and modernity?
In a sense, yes, I think. I'm
No, thank you. Yeah, that's thank you for that. So I was so now if we're thinking about Malay identity, right? What I've in my experience and in my own like research, right, trying to understand a bit of like my grandparents' history, for example, what I thought was very interesting is in my grandfather's time, and this was in the 30s, right? He would, when he talked about the different communities, he talked about the Malays not in a way that we would segment Malays nowadays, I feel, because I feel like nowadays, I mean, other than personally, individually, if you want to claim it, you say like, oh, I'm Mandailing, or I'm Minang, right, or I'm Bugis. That's about where it stops. But but your fellow Malaysians won't look at you as that necessarily unless you mention it. Tapi in the 30s, it seems that everyone was segmented. Like my grandfather would talk about, oh yeah, the Bugis. This man, he was a Bugis. This person, he was a Mandailing. And so it seems like there's a lot of politics that we can talk about it now, where you sort of muted Malay identity, right? Like everyone becomes a Malay. So I was wondering if I could maybe bring it back to the present a little bit. Razan, like, based on your research and then reflecting in the present, what do you think about like the idea of fluidity of Malay identity as shown in your research, and also maybe reflecting in modern day Malaysia? Yeah.
I think Malay identity is actually quite fluid lah, because it is sort of like welcoming, so anyone can be Malay. Even in the Perlembagaan Rakyat proposal, so you say that if you berbahasa Melayu, if you mengamalkan budaya Melayu, then you're already considered as Malay lah, even you're a Chinese or not. That's for Malay, for UMNO, it is seem like an extreme way lah. But back in the 30s and whatnot, I think one of the reason it's not segmented. I think it's more of like how the if you listen to like Shamsul Amri, he always talk about census, how census, colonial census form our identification of identity. So before 1930s, 1910, 1930 and before, Malay is part of a category, and also there's also the Javanese and whatnot that started 1930s. They put all these subcategories under Malay category. So that's when people started to see Javanese and Bugis and everything as Malay, part of Malay.
So it's definitely the result of the politics, all right, and like
Yeah.
the muting of differences, so to speak. Now everyone here, I don't want this to make this a dialogue between me and Razan, just because it's not often that we get together. So please feel free to ask your questions. Yeah, we have one question, and if I may, before we proceed, I also just nak beritahu pada semua hadirin yang soalan juga diterima dalam bahasa Melayu, bahasa Malaysia. Ya, kita faham dan kita boleh sampaikan dan gunakan untuk bicara kita pada malam ini. So moving on to the next question from Zim Ahmadi. I'm sorry if I missed it or if it was discussed, but were there criticisms against these advertisements or satire in mainstream Malay newspapers in visual form? Perhaps maybe counter arguments towards Wak Ketut's character, or maybe anti-modernist stance? Were there any examples of basically anyone who tried to push back or speak back towards these depictions?
I think what Ketuk is, I think Kajai lah. Utusan is a newspaper of itself lah, because at that time, it, like I said, it was the only Malay funded, published and managed newspaper. So before Utusan, all newspapers like Warta, Lembaga and other Malay newspapers that we know as Malay newspapers were funded by either Arab Peranakan or Jawi Peranakan. So the establishment of Utusan is a statement from the KMS that these are the actual Malays that will speak for themselves lah, and not funded by Arab or Jawi Peranakan money. And if you see what Ketuk always criticize the Jawi Peranakan and the Arab Peranakan, so of course there will be a backlash. I'm not sure whether there were cartoons ridiculing Wak Ketuk, but there were a lot of articles written condemning Wak Ketuk's behavior, because Kajai tend to go too much on his criticism, and even the term DKK and DKA was said to be made by Kajai lah.
Thank you, Razan. And we have another. This is a comment, I believe. It's from Archana. To have women represent an entire community has such weightage, and much more with what appears to be with a negative connotation. It feels as if, though, over time, nothing has changed much in that respect for women across different ethnicities. Do you have anything to say in response to that, Razan?
I think, yeah, maybe we can take it another way lah. Why people are always targeting women, especially in different cultures lah, not only Malay, I think. So in many cultures also they will attack the woman first, will be criticized before any other thing. One part is like maybe because the woman is seen as this is from my perspective lah. Woman is seen as the core of a family, and then also reflectively as a core of the society itself lah. So if a woman change, or if a woman from a certain community change, that means the culture of the society also change. So that's why women always became the target of criticism. That's for me.
Thank you. We have another question from Maliana. Hi, I'm researching on Malay art during this period of 1930s onwards. I saw about 2 cartoons where Wak Ketuk was painting. I'm curious if there is any relation between modern art per se and the idea of what modern Malay is and Malay identity. And if Razan may have encountered more of such images in his course of research.
I think that one is just a playful joke for the Arab peranakan. I mean, in other sketches there are also illustrations of Wak Ketuk taking pictures or Wak Ketuk ni. It is seen as part of the lifestyle of that time lah. So if you paint or you play golf and everything, it's not necessarily directly related to the modern art, Malay modern art or something.
So there was no commentary like, oh yeah, the Malay, these cosmopolitan Malays, you know, they would not anyap, they wouldn't weave tikar, they would paint, you know, like is there nothing, no commentary like that lah in your opinion?
I don't think so lah, because I think
Yeah.
Malay modern art or Malaysian modern art lah only started during that time lah, from Abdullah Arif and his peers, and it's not exactly there's no how to say there's no conscious awareness of what modern art is at that time amongst the general Malay.
Okay. So no idea of like the imported art form versus the traditional and all of that.
No.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm scrolling up this. A question from, and this is exactly when my laptop decides to not move. Okay, there you go. By Jia Chen Teo. I'm just trying to understand the context more. What about the politics of the 1930s made inter-Malay distancing a project, whereas now it is, as Razan mentions, an inclusive project? What changed?
Sorry, I'm not sure about the inclusive term. Can you like?
Jia Chen, if you can maybe unmute and share or type.
Yeah, just now, maybe I wasn't following correctly, but Razan, you mentioned that being Malay now is like much more inclusive, like it's easier to be adopted as Malay. Whereas, you know, we're looking at these characters and there's a lot of kind of, I don't know what the word to use, but they're kind of not fighting each other, but they're like talking down about each other. So I'm just, my question's about the politics, the national politics of the time, like why has our conception of these different ethnic groups changed over time?
I think when I was responding to Adriana, I'm just stating that why they identify themselves as Bugis and whatnot, and now as Malays is part of. It's not becoming more inclusive, I think, because it is the way how they perceive it. It's just how they perceive themselves has changed lah, but the distinction still there. Like, okay, if you still identify yourself as Bugis, maybe at the most private level or family level or community level, but in political sense you are Malay. But before that there is no that's why during the 1930s there was a, I would say, increasing awareness of making Malay as one solid political unit, because before that, yeah, like Adriana said, you identifying yourself as Bugis and as Mandaling and whatnot. So what is Malay? Because they are being surrounded by other races, especially from the Chinese and Indian, and these are seen as one political unit. So even if we know that among the Indian communities, there's also other segments, and also among Chinese, there's also Teochew, Hokkien, and whatnot. But they are seen as one political unit, as a race. So I think that is how they approach that during that time, to see to to establish a sense of like Malay race as a political unit lah, so that they can compete with these other races.
Thank you. And if I may add a little bit, Jiachen, just because the way I asked the question earlier, right? The way I see it, maybe I wouldn't use the term inclusive. It's more of like a flattening of identity. So those different distinctions that you used to carry in the public sphere now are, confined to, as Razan said, like the most intimate personal level. Yeah, more like cultural rites and rituals. Yeah, so I would think, but maybe inclusive, the way I see it is more maybe like flattening, yeah, which gives a different dynamic, right, to how the identity is treated. Okay, and then we have a few questions. The next one is from Rosaslina. Can you comment on the role of the newspapers or journalists in the 1930s as a source of intellectual authority? And the second question follow-up is that how can you compare that to the present day? The role of newspapers and journalists?
I think it is obvious that Malay nationalism itself was born from the Malay newspaper. So I think Malay journalists at that time have prominent role. They are very respected, and they also become intellectual authority on certain aspects. Like Bostamam was also a journalist. Rahim Kajai, Ismail, those from PKMM also came from KMS and Utusan actually before the war. Pak Sako. So these are the people who push for independence. And as compared to now, I think it's quite obvious that we don't not only that journalists as an intellectual authority, but also journalists in the sense that providing news that have stances, memberi sikap. So we don't have that much anymore.
If I may ask append a little question, Razan, in your opinion, who are our sources of intellectual authority in Malaysian society today?
Malaysian society,
Who are our sources of intellectual authority?
I'm not sure.
And that is an answer in itself, because I also actually wouldn't know, wouldn't be able to give an honest to goodness answer that's not unironic or me being cheeky. Okay, moving on to the next question from Simon Sun. Who is Ali Sanat, and can you tell us more about him? Where did he come from, and what was his political position? And after the Second World War, what became of him?
I think Alisana is still a mystery to everyone lah, because there's almost no record of him. Even in Mulyadi's book, he mentioned that like this is the problem in newspapers back then lah, Malay newspapers, because they don't record their contributors. So there's almost no info about him at all. So I don't think I can answer.
Okay, thank you, Razan. Let's see, and then we have a thank you from Maliana. You're welcome. Zim has a comment to your earlier response, Razan. Thank you. I did not know that Utusan Zaman was the only Malay-funded newspaper at the time. I thought at least the discourse from the Arab Peranakan and Jawi Peranakan would bring some great visual variety against increasing pure Malay nationalism. And I think that's a very interesting question, Zim. It's like, did they not lawan? Did they not talk back, since they have so many, since it sounds like they were the wealthier class, right? Yeah. And okay, the next question is by Aidila. Following up on the earlier question, was there a response from groups who identify themselves as modern cosmopolitan Malays to these criticisms against them?
I'm not sure in terms of writing or not, because maybe there are some lah in other newspapers, but I'm not aware of it for now.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I'm scrolling down from Nina S. Just from newspaper coverage and editorials, when could you pinpoint this shift to that pan-Malay identity? Did it come after World War II in the backdrop of the Malayan Union? And some clarification there, a shift to a stronger, more defined Malay identity, not just regional, ethnic, or tribal.
I think Malayan Union is the culmination of what was happening before the war. I mean, Utusan was, for me, the starting point. Like even before that lah, the KMS, if you trace it back earlier, Utusan also filled with people from KMS. So these are the ideas that was brought out by Muhammad Yunus back in 1920s, and it sustained itself through Utusan and became, maybe it changed form in the 1950s and 60s, but the core idea is, I think, still the same lah, to see Malay as one ethnic.
Thank you. The next question is from Zim Ahmadi. It's a parallel to the rise of nationalism around the world at that time as a way to combat colonialism. The question of who belongs in what nation became more prominent. It became less and less popular to call oneself Bugis, for example, than to call oneself Malay. Yes, flattening of identity. Love that phrase. Razan and I claim shared credit for that. You're welcome, Zim. Okay, Jiachin says, thank you, you're welcome. And now a question by Dr. Jomo Sundaram. Thank you very much, Razan. The DKK discourse was imported from Indonesia, where the role of DKA in particular was resented. The broader, more inclusive category of Malays was being promoted by the British from the 1930s, but were Javanese already considered Malay then compared to the Sumatran ethnicities? Can you discuss how the representation of ethnicities changed with the Japanese occupation and immediately after the war?
Sitting. Change as in among the Malay community or in Malaya itself? Is it among the Malay community itself?
Dr. Jomo, perhaps if you could unmute and clarify or type in the chat box.
It'll take me too long to type. Sorry, what? I didn't understand Razan's question.
I mean, the change of representation of ethnicities, is it among the Malay itself or in Malaya in general?
Oh, no. Basically, the category of Malay was changing. I think as Adriana, before the war, it was still common to identify with your what we now call sub-ethnicity, Mandailing, etc., etc. Javanese and Bugis were not considered Melayu. Melayu, the original conception of Melayu was basically Sumatra. It didn't really go to Java, and certainly not to Java. In fact, because Javanese often came as contract laborers, they were looked down upon. So and in contrast, the DKA were relatively privileged, mainly in trade and so on and so forth. So there was so how I'm curious to understand, because in the 1930s, the British, through the census and other things, were trying to create these new ethnic categories: Melayu, Malay, Chinese, even Indian. These were the MIC categories were all created basically during the 1930s. But there was still ambiguity about the Javanese and so on. So I'm basically asking, how, in a sense, the question is partly to Adriana also, because how did this change during the 30s? I mean, the British were defensive because the economy was a mess, okay? And they basically needed to invent all this. So how did this change during the 30s and then during the Japanese occupation? Because the Japanese also had a different type of divide and rule policy, right? And then after that, as you correctly pointed out, the culmination in the Malayan Union, but before UMNO, there was Pekemam, right? And so how did it change? Is it because Utusan actually was committed to an idea of a Bangsa Melayu ala Bustamam, which was basically not defined narrowly in terms of ethnicity or genealogy, something which is almost inconceivable, But at that time, that was the view. So I'm trying to understand how how all this changed, is it? Because I think there was more than Kajai.
Yeah.
And so was there contestation among this? Because after the war, you have Melayu Raya versus Utusan. Melayu Raya was playing much more of a Malay card, so to speak, whereas Utusan was much more what we would now call in English a Malayan nation, you know? And so I'm trying to get a sense of, maybe your research stops in 1930, so it's not fair question to ask you, but I'm curious about how it might have changed, you know? And Adriana, you should feel free to talk about this as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. Razan, if you have a response to that?
I'm not very much aware about the Javanese and the categorization, but I think, yeah, there sure was a constitution and those who later established KMM, Sama Ismail, and the changing notion of what Utusan KMS Malay that acknowledge the people of the Malaya itself. And but I think KMF definition is more inclusive rather than the Utusan itself. Like they also consider those who are not who doesn't share the same ethnicity as Malay, if they like bercakap bahasa Melayu and berbudaya Melayu.
Thank you, Razan. I don't know if it's just me, but I felt that the problem with the high pitch sound came back. So you were a bit muffled actually. Could you try and speak now?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just now I felt like the earlier audio issue we had came back of like the high pitch sound. So I couldn't really hear what you said. Can we try again?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Razan. Sorry to make you do this, but do you think you could repeat briefly what you just said in response to Dr. Jomo?
Oh, I was out of sound just now.
Macam to me at least like a part of you was like cut off, and then that shrill like sound came back.
I'm not very much aware of how the categorization shifted after the war, but I think Utusan and KMS they started this too much inclusive, like they don't only consider Malay as in Malay in Malaya. I think they also the descent from, like Prof. Jomo said, from the Sumatran descendant as Malay, but his predecessor like Pak Sako, Bos Tamam, Isam Ismail, who later established KMM, they went a step further to include other ethnicities who practice the Malay culture and as Malay. So that's the two strands that I can see.
Thank you, Razan. And my quick response is to apologize because my research has been rather anecdotal within a family oral history documentation project, and it ends just around the Japanese occupation. So I haven't really been able to dive deep into that. But question of fluidity of identity is something that personally I find very fascinating. So hopefully, I don't know, the discussion can continue maybe in future PSR webinars. Thank you very much for the questions. I would like to just make an open call maybe for one more question if anybody has any burning questions that they'd like to ask before we wrap up. Okay. I think that silence is our answer. Thank you so much, Razan. Before we wrap up, I'd like to call back Simon, our commentator this evening, to share a few thoughts.
Hi, Adriana, and hi, Razan, again. So maybe just a short reflection. Perhaps it's really quite important for us to remember that the illustrations really only began in the late 30s, and specifically from 1938 onwards. And I don't think they represent the entire decade of the 1930s, and certainly not the entire range of positions that were available to, say, a Malay person interested to sort of like think through some of what it means to be modern during that period. And I think if one Wakato appears misogynistic or on some level, we have to remember there are also other platforms where people were competing and fighting for different kinds of representation. And women were doing so through, journals like Utusan Melayu, which was founded because they felt like, what was that? Majalah Buruh was merely being tokenistic, and they gave them like, a small column space and things like that. So maybe in considering like, the entire ecology in which like people were sort of like arguing and talking against each other, it's also perhaps important to remember that the Malay world or the Malay community doesn't sort of exist in an echo chamber. It's also speaking across to other communities. It's also borrowing languages, and there are a lot of cross influences sort of going on amongst different newspapers or periodicals published in different languages. And I think the more exciting thing that we can do now is really to sort of like track this intercultural sort of like conversations, in spite of the fact that generally these periodicals tend to carry views that are perhaps slightly either sort of like racist or communal or whatever. But I think the images are doing something else, and perhaps paying attention to the image. And that's why we should pay attention to the image. And that's why paying attention to the image can tell us something else about how people sort of like overhear each other and influence each other in the same period.
Thank you, Simon. What you said just now just made me recall my readings in my undergraduate degree in anthropology, where they say the thing about ethnic identity, especially, is it's about who you are, but also who you're not, right? Like that's the way where you harden those boundaries between ethnic groups. So I really enjoyed what you had to say, because that then triggered these questions about how I guess it's the how the different groups saw one another. And it would be fascinating for me personally to know how that changes now, like have we become a bit more resigned, if I may use that term, to ethnic boundaries and the firmness and hardness of them, or how permeable they are. Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. Razan, as the man of the hour, I must give you the opportunity to say a few last words.
I don't have much to say lah, but in terms of like what Simon says, I think there is also I think we are seeing it now lah. What the so-called 1930s Utusan is seeing as the sort of like cosmopolitan or modern Malays. That we are seeing now that a generation that started to identify themselves as Malaysian first instead of like race first, and there are a lot of them now. And so I think we should focus on creating, like there's a friend who always said that we should create a shared narrative that merangkup semua yang ada secara bersama.
That's a lovely note to end on. I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Razan. Thank you, Simon, really, for adding so much flesh and richness to our conversations. I really appreciated that. And thank you so much to the audience for your engagement, for your curiosity, for your questions. May our conversations continue in other platforms and at other times. Thank you, everyone, and good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Razan.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for great moderation. And thank you, Razan and Simon, for a really great discussion. And to all the, to everyone who showed up and also asked questions. Thank you so much. It was really fruitful and insightful. And I think it triggered a lot of new questions and hopefully new research that will come out from this. So thank you again to everyone. And I just wanted to advertise a little bit. Next month, we have another great, interesting presentation, which was by Khalida Talib on student activism, reclaiming the narrative. So please do join in for our conversation next month. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night and stay safe.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, PSR.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank Thank you, Lynn.